Ever since my son, Jake, was old enough to climb trees, he'd always dreamed of having a treehouse of his own. Not just any treehouse, he wanted one with a wooden ladder, a small balcony, and enough space to sit inside with his books or action figures. As a father, I wanted to make that dream come true. So, after months of planning, sketching ideas with him, and gathering the necessary materials, we finally built the perfect backyard escape. It wasn't some massive structure that overshadowed the neighborhood. No, it was a modest but well-built treehouse nestled in the large oak tree at the back of our yard. Jake was over the moon, and for the first time in a while, I saw a kind of joy on his face that made all the effort worth it. Building the treehouse wasn't just about giving my son a fun place to play. It was about spending time together, making memories. Over several weekends we worked side by side. I taught him how to use a hammer properly, how to measure wood before cutting, and how to be patient when things didn't go as planned. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were frustrating moments, like when a board wouldn't fit right, or when we realized we needed more nails and had to make an unexpected trip to the hardware store. But through it all, we laughed, we learned, and we bonded in a way that words can't fully describe. When it was finally done, Jake invited his best friend over to check it out. The two of them climbed up, peeked out from the tiny balcony, and declared it the best treehouse ever. Watching from below, I felt an immense sense of pride. I had given my son something I never had growing up, a special place that was just for him. For a few weeks, everything was perfect. Jake spent nearly every afternoon up in his treehouse, reading comics, drawing pictures, and pretending he was a pirate looking out from his ship. Even my wife, who was initially skeptical about the whole project, admitted that it turned out beautifully. Then, one day, the letter came. It was from the Homeowners Association. I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach as I read the words. Your recently constructed treehouse violates HOA regulations and must be removed immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines and further action. I couldn't believe what I was reading. What kind of rule was this? I had lived in this neighborhood for years, and I had never once heard of a ban on treehouses. Jake noticed the look on my face and asked what was wrong. I hesitated for a moment before telling him that the HOA had a problem with his treehouse. His smile disappeared instantly. But why? He asked, his voice filled with confusion. I didn't have a good answer. Determined to fight this, I grabbed the HOA handbook we had received when we moved in and flipped through the pages. There were rules about fence height, lawn maintenance, and even what colors we were allowed to paint our houses, but nothing specific about tree houses. So, where exactly was this violation coming from? I decided to call the HOA office. After being put on hold for what felt like an eternity, a cold, monotonous voice finally picked up. Hello, this is Brenda from the HOA. How may I assist you? Yes, I received a notice about my son's treehouse being a violation. Can you tell me exactly which rule it's breaking? There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard before she finally responded. It falls under the category of unauthorized external structures. I frowned. But it's not an external structure. It's in my backyard, within my property line, and it's built into a tree that has been here for decades. The rules apply to all unapproved additions, she said flatly. You'll need to take it down immediately. I wasn't about to take their word for it. I asked for a copy of the specific rule they were citing, and Brenda promised to email it to me. When I finally received it, I was even more frustrated. The document was vague, with wording that could be interpreted in multiple ways. It was almost as if the HOA made up the rule just to have an excuse to enforce it. I wasn't going to let them win that easily. The next day, I reached out to some of my neighbors, asking if they had ever heard of the HOA going after treehouses before. Most of them were just as surprised as I was. A few of them even had playsets in their backyards that had never been challenged. It didn't take long before I realized that this wasn't just about some arbitrary rule, it was personal. I started wondering, why were they suddenly coming after my son's treehouse? It wasn't big or flashy. It didn't block anyone's view. It wasn't loud or disruptive. It was just a simple wooden treehouse in my backyard. That's when my next-door neighbor, Mr. Peterson, gave me an interesting piece of information. "I wouldn't be surprised if this was about Mrs. Caldwell," he said. Mrs. Caldwell, the HOA president. Apparently, she had a long history of targeting specific homeowners whenever she didn't like something. According to Mr. Peterson, she once forced a family to remove their front porch swing because she thought it looked too rustic for the neighborhood's aesthetic. Another time, she made a couple repaint their garage door because she didn't approve of the shade of blue they had chosen. This wasn't about my son's treehouse. This was about control. And I wasn't about to let her win. After discovering that Mrs. Caldwell, the HOA president, was likely the one behind the complaint, I knew I had a fight on my hands. But I wasn't prepared for just how far they would go. The very next morning, another letter arrived, this time, hand-delivered by an HOA representative. The envelope was marked urgent, and when I tore it open, my blood started boiling. Final notice: your unauthorized structure must be removed within 7 days, or the HOA will take legal action. Continued non-compliance may result in forced removal at the homeowner's expense. Forced removal? At my expense? Were they seriously threatening to tear down my son's treehouse and charge me for it? I gripped the letter so tightly that the paper crumpled in my hands. Jake, who had just come inside from playing, saw the look on my face. "Dad? What's wrong?" I hesitated for a second, not wanting to worry him, but I also believed in being honest. "The HOA wants us to take down the treehouse, buddy." His eyes widened. "But why?" I knelt down to his level and put a hand on his shoulder. "Because some people like to make rules just to have power over others. But don't worry, we're not giving up without a fight." I wasn't going to just accept this ridiculous demand. I needed answers. So, I marched straight to the HOA office, where I was greeted by none other than Brenda, the same unhelpful woman I had spoken to on the phone. She barely glanced up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said firmly, slapping the letter onto the counter. "You can start by explaining why the HOA is threatening to tear down a child's treehouse." Brenda sighed, clearly annoyed. "Sir, we've already explained that unauthorized structures—" "No," I interrupted. "You sent me a vague, half-baked explanation. But I looked through the HOA guidelines, and there is nothing that explicitly bans treehouses. So tell me, which specific rule am I violating?" She narrowed her eyes and folded her arms. "The board has decided that your structure does not align with the aesthetics of the neighborhood." I nearly laughed out loud. "Aesthetics? It's a treehouse. It's in my backyard, surrounded by trees. How exactly is it ruining the look of the neighborhood?" Before she could answer, I heard a voice behind me. Well, Mr. Carter. Causing trouble again, I see." I turned to see Mrs. Caldwell standing there, a smug smile plastered across her face. She was a woman in her 60s, always dressed in perfectly pressed business suits as if she were running a Fortune 500 company instead of a suburban HOA. "I'd hardly call asking questions causing trouble," I replied, crossing my arms. "I just want to know why my son's treehouse is suddenly such a problem." She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "The HOA has rules in place for a reason, Mr. Carter. Structures like that can lower property values, and we must maintain the integrity of our community." I clenched my fists. "Lower property values? Do you honestly think a treehouse, hidden in my backyard, is going to tank the market? Or is this just another one of your personal vendettas?" Her face twitched slightly, as if I had hit a nerve. "The decision has been made. You have 7 days to remove it, or the HOA will handle it for you." I walked out of that office fuming, but I wasn't going to let Mrs. Caldwell bully me into submission. If she wanted to play games, fine, I could play too. That evening, I started knocking on doors, talking to my neighbors. To my surprise, most of them were just as fed up with the HOA as I was. "I've lived here for 15 years, said Mr. Peterson, my next-door neighbor. "They've been getting worse every year. First, they forced me to repaint my mailbox because the color wasn't neutral enough. Then they fined the Johnsons for leaving their trash bins out 10 minutes past collection time. And now this? Others shared similar horror stories. Fines for minor infractions, absurd rules that seemed to change whenever the HOA saw fit, and ridiculous power plays from Mrs. Caldwell. "I bet she's just targeting you because she doesn't like that you stand up to her," one neighbor suggested. "That's how she operates." By the time I finished making my rounds, I had a small army of angry homeowners who were just as tired of the HOA's nonsense as I was. The next day, I drafted a formal petition to stop the forced removal of the treehouse. It stated that the HOA's actions were unjust, that there was no clear rule prohibiting treehouses, and that their enforcement was purely arbitrary. I collected signatures from nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood. Even people who didn't have kids supported me because they knew if the HOA could do this to me, they could do it to anyone. Then, I took it straight to the HOA office and demanded a hearing before they took any action. At first, Brenda and Mrs. Caldwell tried to brush me off, but when I informed them that I had nearly the entire neighborhood backing me, their confidence wavered. "Fine," Mrs. Caldwell said through gritted teeth. "We'll schedule a meeting." But they weren't done yet. I thought I had bought myself some time, but the next morning, I woke up to something shocking, an official HOA notice taped to my front door. "Due to your continued noncompliance and disruptive behavior, the HOA is considering additional penalties. Your presence at the upcoming board meeting is required." Additional penalties? They were doubling down, trying to intimidate me into backing off. But they had no idea who they were messing with. I wasn't just fighting for a treehouse anymore. I was fighting against an abuse of power. And if they wanted to escalate things, I was more than ready. I wasn't about to let the HOA walk all over me. They had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. If they thought their threats and intimidation tactics would scare me into compliance, they were in for a rude awakening. The morning after receiving the latest HOA notice, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the piece of paper in my hands. Additional penalties? What did that even mean? Were they going to fine me, take legal action, or try something even more extreme? I wasn't going to sit around and wait for them to make the next move. It was time to take this fight to the next level. I spent the rest of the morning going through the HOA's rulebook, highlighting anything that might work in my favor. If they wanted to play by the rules, I was going to outsmart them with their own handbook. And that's when I found something interesting. There was a clause stating that any HOA rule or decision could be challenged if a petition with signatures from at least 60% of homeowners was submitted before the enforcement date. I checked my list of signatures. I had already gathered support from nearly 80% of my neighbors. That meant the HOA had no legal ground to proceed with their removal of the treehouse. But knowing Mrs. Caldwell, she wouldn't let that stop her. I needed more than just a petition. I needed a strategy. At this point, I decided it was time to bring in some professional help. I contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, Mr. Daniel Green. After explaining the situation over the phone, he agreed to meet with me that same afternoon. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me with a confident smile. "You'd be surprised how often I deal with HOA power trips like this." I handed him copies of the petition, the HOA's rulebook, and every letter they had sent me so far. As he read through them, his expression shifted from amused to serious. "This is bad," he muttered, flipping through the papers. I tensed. "How bad?" He set the documents down and looked me in the eye. "Legally speaking, you have the upper hand. Your treehouse doesn't violate any explicit rules, and your petition meets the requirement to challenge their decision. But I've seen HOAs pull some dirty tricks when they feel threatened." "Like what?" "Altering bylaws without notice, suddenly enforcing new restrictions, slapping homeowners with false fines, or even trying to foreclose on homes over unpaid HOA dues." I clenched my fists. "They can't do that." "Can they?" He sighed. "It depends. Some HOAs are just bullies who back down when confronted with the law. Others will fight tooth and nail, even when they know they're in the wrong." I exhaled sharply. "So what do I do?" Show up at that HOA meeting prepared. Have your documents in order, remain calm no matter how much they try to provoke you, and let them know you're willing to take this to court if necessary. I nodded. Got it. As I was leaving his office, he called out. And one more thing, record everything. If they try to pull any stunts, you'll want proof. I thanked him and left, feeling more confident than ever. Later that evening, as I was making dinner, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to see Mrs. Caldwell standing there, arms crossed, wearing her usual condescending smirk. Good evening, Mr. Carter, she said in that fake sweet tone of hers. I leaned against the doorframe. Mrs. Caldwell, what brings you here? She tilted her head. I wanted to give you one final chance to comply before things get messy. I narrowed my eyes. Messy? She sighed dramatically. The HOA has been very patient with you, but if you continue to be uncooperative, there will be consequences. I folded my arms. Are you threatening me? She gave a small laugh. Oh no, not at all. I'm simply warning you that your refusal to comply could result in additional fines, restrictions, or even legal action. I pretended to consider her words. You know, Mrs. Caldwell, I actually had a meeting with a lawyer today. Her smirk faltered. A lawyer? I nodded. And he seems to think the HOA is on very shaky legal ground. She forced a smile. Well, we'll just have to see about that. With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, but I could tell she was rattled. The next morning, I woke up to something that made my blood boil. Jake was the one who noticed it first. He ran into my room, shaking me awake. Dad! Dad! Someone messed up my treehouse! I shot up in bed. What? I followed him outside, and sure enough, the treehouse had been vandalized. The wooden ladder had been ripped off, one of the windows was smashed, and there was spray paint across the side that read, "Remove or else." My jaw clenched. This wasn't just HOA pressure anymore. This was sabotage. I immediately checked my security cameras, but the footage was missing. Someone had tampered with my system. And I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. I wasn't just angry, I was furious. The HOA had crossed the line, and now I wasn't just fighting to save a treehouse. I was fighting against their corruption, bullying, and outright illegal behavior. If they wanted war, they had it. I spent the rest of the day preparing for the HOA meeting. I compiled all my evidence, photos of the vandalism, security footage logs showing the system was tampered with, and copies of every HOA notice I had received. I also emailed every neighbor who had signed my petition, letting them know what had happened. The response was overwhelming. People were outraged. They had been willing to support me before, but now they were ready to fight. The HOA meeting was the next day, and I was going to make damn sure it was one they'd never forget. I was still seething over the vandalism of Jake's treehouse when I walked into the HOA meeting the next evening. But instead of storming in with fists clenched, I kept my expression neutral. I wasn't going to let them see how rattled I was. The community center was packed, way more than usual. Clearly, word had spread about what was happening. Neighbors who had never attended before were here, watching, waiting. Some of them gave me small nods of encouragement as I passed. I took my seat near the front, arms crossed as I stared at the HOA board members. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the center, acting as if she owned the place, with her usual smug smirk. The meeting started with boring formalities, community maintenance updates, budget reports, and other nonsense. I could feel my patience running thin as they danced around the real issue. Finally, Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat. Now, before we proceed, we need to address a matter that has caused quite a bit of unrest in our community. Her eyes locked onto mine, fake concern plastered across her face. The unauthorized structure, Mr. Carter's treehouse. Mrs. Caldwell sighed dramatically, flipping through a stack of papers. After multiple warnings, Mr. Carter has failed to comply with the HOA's guidelines regarding unapproved exterior structures. As such, the board has decided that. I cut her off before she could finish. Decided what? To destroy my son's treehouse? A murmur spread through the crowd. Some people were nodding in agreement. Others looked confused. Clearly, they hadn't heard about the vandalism yet. Mrs. Caldwell pursed her lips. Mr. Carter, this is not personal. The HOA exists to maintain order and uniformity in our neighborhood. Allowing one exception would set a dangerous precedent. I scoffed. A dangerous precedent? It's a treehouse, not a skyscraper. And let's not pretend this is about community standards. I pulled out a stack of printed HOA violation notices and held them up for everyone to see. This is what I've received over the last few weeks. Meanwhile, my next-door neighbor has an illegal shed, and another house has a swing set in their front yard, but you haven't gone after them. Why? More murmurs. People were turning to each other, whispering. Some even started pointing at their own houses, probably realizing the HOA had been selectively enforcing rules. Mrs. Caldwell's smirk faltered for the first time. Those matters are separate. We are discussing your violations right now. No, we're discussing the fact that the HOA is corrupt. Silence. Then, one of my neighbors, a guy named Mr. Thompson, spoke up. Wait a minute, he's right. My backyard pergola never got approved, but I've never received a single notice. Another neighbor chimed in. And what about the Petersons? They painted their shutters bright blue. Wasn't there a rule against that? Mrs. Caldwell's expression darkened. She was losing control of the room. I let the chaos simmer for a few seconds before delivering my next blow. I did some research. I continued, pulling out another folder. It turns out that the HOA board members, specifically Mrs. Caldwell and a few others, have been approving certain property modifications for a price. Gasps. I slammed the documents onto the table in front of me. These are records of payments made to the HOA from homeowners who somehow had their violations erased. I pointed at Mrs. Caldwell. And guess whose name appears on almost every one of those approval signatures? The crowd erupted. People started shouting, some in disbelief, others in anger. Even the other board members looked shocked. Mrs. Caldwell's face went pale. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Carter. It's not an accusation. It's proof. I held up my phone. I also have a recording of a conversation between me and another board member, who admitted that you decide which violations get enforced and which ones get ignored. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes darted around, searching for a way out. But she was cornered. The meeting was in full chaos now. People were demanding answers, shouting at the board, and calling for Mrs. Caldwell's resignation. But just when I thought I had her, she pulled one last trick. She straightened her posture, took a deep breath, and put on the fakest concerned expression I'd ever seen. This is all very troubling, she said smoothly. And I think we need to conduct a full investigation. I narrowed my eyes. Investigation? We have all the proof we need right here. She ignored me. In the meantime, I am proposing an immediate fine against Mr. Carter for his continued defiance of HOA regulations. Effective immediately, he will be required to pay. But before she could finish her sentence, a loud bang echoed through the room. Someone had slammed their hand against the table. It was Mr. Peterson, a well-respected older neighbor. Enough of this nonsense. We've had it with you, Caldwell. People cheered. The crowd had officially turned against her. Another board member, one of the few not involved in her corruption, stood up. I motion to put Mrs. Caldwell's removal up for a community vote. A wave of hands shot up. I watched as Mrs. Caldwell's face twisted in horror. She opened her mouth to argue, but it was too late. The HOA had turned on their own leader. I left the meeting feeling victorious, but I knew the fight wasn't over. Sure, Mrs. Caldwell was on her way out, but that didn't mean the rest of the HOA wouldn't try to cover up their actions. I needed to make sure they paid for what they had done, not just to me, but to every homeowner they had bullied and cheated. So I started preparing for my final move. The real revenge was coming. And it was going to be glorious. With Mrs. Caldwell effectively ousted from her position, the tides had turned in my favor. But I wasn't about to let this end with just her resignation. No, after everything she'd put my family through, after vandalizing my son's treehouse, after threatening legal action, after selectively enforcing HOA rules to punish those who wouldn't bow to her, I was going to make sure she paid for it all. That meant one thing: exposing everything. The day after the explosive HOA meeting, I got to work. I contacted several neighbors who had spoken up during the meeting, including Mr. Peterson and Mr. Thompson. They were just as fired up as I was. "Caldwell thinks she can just walk away and sweep this under the rug," Mr. Peterson said over coffee. "Not happening." We decided to gather even more evidence. The financial records I had were solid, but I knew there had to be more dirt: hidden bank transfers, shady contracts, backdoor deals. With the help of a few tech-savvy neighbors, we started digging through HOA records, community emails, and financial reports. What we found was worse than we ever imagined. Not only had Mrs. Caldwell been taking bribes, but she had also been funneling HOA funds into a personal account. Tens of thousands of dollars in unexplained transactions. That was it. The smoking gun. Once we had enough evidence, I decided it was time to go public. Step 1: Local news. A few phone calls later, a reporter from a well-known news station agreed to meet with me. When I showed them the evidence, their eyes widened. "This is massive," they said. "We're running this story." Step 2: Social media. I took to the neighborhood's Facebook group and posted everything. Screenshots of the financial records. Copies of emails. Proof of HOA abuse. It went viral within hours. Hundreds of comments flooded in. "I knew she was shady. I want my HOA fees refunded. How do we sue her?" And my favorite: "Time to get rid of the HOA completely." As expected, Mrs. Caldwell panicked. She sent a desperate email to the HOA members, calling everything a misunderstanding. Then she tried blaming it all on other board members. But it was too late. The news report aired that evening, featuring interviews with me, Mr. Peterson, and several other neighbors who had been wronged by the HOA. The journalist even uncovered legal complaints against Mrs. Caldwell from previous neighborhoods. Turns out, she had a history of this behavior. By the end of the day, she was completely disgraced. She resigned from the HOA immediately. But that wasn't enough. I wanted justice. With a group of neighbors, we hired a lawyer and filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA for mismanagement of funds and harassment. At first, the remaining HOA board members tried to defend themselves, but too much evidence was stacked against them. Faced with legal pressure, the entire HOA board resigned. And then came the final, sweetest victory of all. A vote was held, and we disbanded the HOA entirely. No more fines. No more ridiculous rules. No more corrupt, power-hungry board members. With the HOA gone, I rebuilt Jake's treehouse, bigger and better than before. This time, with the entire neighborhood's support. People even pitched in to help. One neighbor donated wood, another brought tools, and soon, what started as a small project became a symbol of our community standing together. The day it was finished, Jake's face lit up brighter than I'd ever seen. "This is the best treehouse ever, Dad," he said, climbing up the ladder. And as I watched my son play in his safe, restored treehouse, I knew we had won.